Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Valentine's Day is this weekend, and to celebrate, the AV Club is doing a full week of Love Week content. On today's episode, Katie and I will discuss our own relationship to cinematic romance, the cliches we love, the cliches we hate, and which movies we swoon over the most.
Welcome to Film Club. So, Alex, it's Valentine's Day week. By the time our listeners are hearing this podcast, we're going to be creeping up on Valentine's Day weekend. It's on a Sunday this year, and I know some people love Valentine's Day, and a lot of people really hate it and have a complicated relationship with it. So that's kind of something I wanted to delve into on the podcast today. Maybe get a little bit more personal about, how film affects our lives. And I think one thing that's interesting is, rom-coms have been around for a really long time. You can look back on Jane Austen even. Those are rom-com novels.
Mm-hmm.
But you and I came up in the early 2000s when there was a rom-com renaissance going on. One that I remember it as being really cheesy and unbearable.
Mm-hmm.
This was the era of Bridget Jones' Diary and Notting Hill, a lot of movies starring Jennifer Lopez and Katherine Heigl, who was kind of the queen of this era. We have our column When Romance Met Comedy. Caroline Seed writes that column, and she had written about two separate Katherine Heigl vehicles defending 27 Dresses, but at the same time she called The Ugly Truth possibly the worst rom-com ever made. And often in these films, these women were paired up with a pre-McConaissance Matthew McConaughey. He was a rom-com guy back in the 2000s. And what did you think of this phenomenon when it was happening, Dowd? Because I fully, I'm not proud of it now, but around this time when I was, a late teenager, my early 20s, I kind of fell for that cool girl trap where I was like, I'm not like other girls. I don't like frilly girly things. I'm a punk rocker. I don't care about stuff like that. I like art. And, it's embarrassing in retrospect, but in my defense, there was a lot of messaging in the culture that encouraged that around the time.
Well, I think it was easy to hate romantic comedies if you were, if you were in your late teens or early 20s around the time that you're talking about. And Caroline has written a lot about this particular period. It's sort of the because the 90s are thought of as a true Renaissance period for the romantic comedy genre. I mean, you're talking this sort of post When Harry Met Sally, and a time when movie stars like Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks were making romantic comedies, and they were sort of garnering a level of prestige that they maybe hadn't garnered honestly, there have always been rom-coms that have been critically acclaimed. There have always been ones that people have liked. Woody Allen in the 70s and 80s made a lot of them. Albert Brooks, something like Working Girl in the 80s. But the early 2000s was a time in which we sort of saw the conventions of 90s romantic comedies curdling into a really disposable formula.
Absolutely. In some ways, it was sort of a parallel phenomenon to the curdling of alternative music and punk rock into something very, mall friendly was happening around the same time.
That's a very good comparison, because I feel like the people with the money will always find a way to take something that's genuine and turn it into something that's fundamentally phony. I've never hated romantic comedies. I think that, like you, I was an angsty teenager who thought himself edgier than he really was. But even at that time, I think I was kind of susceptible to some romantic cliches and to some into that idea about the world. I think that one thing about romantic comedies is that I think they do inform more than we'd probably like to admit a lot of people's attitudes about love and their expectations about it. And I'm sure back when I had no love life to speak of, I'm sure that I let romantic comedies inform my idea of what falling in love was supposed to be like.
Right. Yeah, totally. And it's interesting. This is something we'll get into a little bit more later. But when I look back on it, I think one of the things I was kind of railing against was that I didn't really want the thing, the version of romance that they showed in those movies wasn't appealing to me. And so
Right.
I was just like, well, fuck all of this. I just threw it all out the window because I didn't like that idea.
And that can be really alienating. I mean, when you see,
Mm-hmm.
we talked about this on the Christmas episode a little bit, and this is sort of a
Yeah.
tangent, but when everything in the culture is saying this is how you're supposed to feel, and you don't feel that way, and you don't see yourself in it. I mean, obviously, as a white cis dude, I see myself in a lot of media. It is
Mm-hmm.
constantly being made to reflect my my supposed interests and my supposed cultural desires
Sure.
and identity. But
Yeah.
the fact
What studio heads think your desires and identity
exactly,
are, right?
exactly, yeah. So I when we talk about alienation, I really probably don't even know the half of it. But what it comes down to is that when, particularly with something as personal as falling in love or romance or sexual desire or anything of that sort, when all you're seeing is when what you're seeing on screen you're not connecting to in any way, it can be alienating, and I understand lashing out against that.
Yeah, totally. But like I was saying, I think around this time, this is something I never really heard articulated in the media actually until the book Gone Girl came out.
Mhm.
But that whole cool girl idea was really prevalent around this time in the early 2000s of just like, yeah, I don't care about having a boyfriend or or the I don't wear pink. I'm not interested in girly things, like I'm edgy and cool and one of the guys. And it is something that you look back on with ambivalence because I think part of it was like I was saying a sort of reaction to not identifying with these cliches that I was seeing and being told that this is what I wanted. Like, for example, the idea that every little girl dreams of having a gigantic wedding someday. I never once thought about my wedding as a child ever. Like, it's just not something that I ever identified with. And I think that was part of it, but and then the other part of it was that I was trying to move in these spaces that were very male dominated, and so you can adapt a sort of one of the guys' attitude is sort of a survival mechanism.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I can imagine that, because I mean, there is a lot of romantic comedies this is another thing that Caroline writes about all the time in her column, which is that romantic comedies, it is a misunderstood genre in some respects, and one that a lot of people, particularly men, will dismiss outright as because implicitly these are movies for women, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there is a lot of contempt for the feminine going on there. And that is something that actually I have changed a lot about over the years. I've learned to really embrace unabashed femininity, not associate it with weakness or stupidity, which is things that were just completely subconsciously instilled in me when I was younger, that like being interested in fashion or reading romance made you somehow like silly and or frivolous, and it wasn't the same as being interested in capital A art.
I will say that I am glad that we are culturally, we are at least we are trying to move away from that idea and from that notion that somehow something that is inherently feminine is lesser, is inferior, or is somehow less interesting. I will say that you can simultaneously hold that belief in your head and also look at something like the run of rom-coms in the early 2000s and still reject them for your own aesthetic reasons,
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I think the key is to not go in saying this is going to be dumb because.
Exactly. Yeah, because I mean, and I think about this as film critics, that I think that in general, I think the best critics are people who do not have a chip on their shoulder about a particular genre. We all have things that we like more than other things. You and I happen to both like horror, for example. But I think that to truly excel at what you and I do, I think you have to have an open mind about different genres and different kinds of movies. Because if your whole thing is I hate westerns or I hate musicals or I hate romantic comedies, that's a blinder, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely a blinder. Yeah, and it's going to influence because you're going to go in looking for flaws and looking for ways to pick things apart,
Yeah.
And so a lot of times if you go looking for something, you're going to find it.
For sure. I will say that my relationship to romantic comedies has changed over the years, only in the sense that I'm still susceptible to some of their ideas about the world and some of their cliches.
Mm,
I think
mm.
I think what's changed is that as I've developed as a person, and I've developed a love life, and I have actual experience
Mm-hmm.
with dating and with with falling in love. I do have a little bit more resentment for films that I feel like cheapen that idea
Yeah.
by turning it into a series of conventions.
Sure, yeah, and like something that's really prevalent, particularly well, I suppose in all romantic comedies. I don't know enough about the genre to say for sure, but something that I remember happening in a lot of these 2000s films that we mentioned up top was that there'd be some sort of trick played. There was always some kind of subterfuge going on, and they would trick people into
Yeah.
falling in love, and that never sat right with me.
Well, no, I mean that's horrible. But you're right that that's just sort of an accepted. It's really interesting to track the way that our cultural attitudes about men and women, for example, have changed over the years, as reflected in romantic comedies, and the type of behavior that we've accepted as totally fine, or as totally as even charming. I think that's changed. I mean, one of the things I really liked about Promising Young Woman, the recent Carey Mulligan film, it's the sort of pop indie take on the revenge thriller, the rape revenge movie. One of the things I really liked about it is that I do think it has some sly critiques of the romantic comedy to offer.
Totally, and it totally does. It indulges in that same idea that I was talking about, as rejecting the girly as weak or undesirable. So yeah, one of the things before we recorded this episode, I was thinking about the cliches in this, and I was wondering, so for me, the cliche in these I hate the most is the idea of, like I said, the subterfuge of tricking someone into falling in love with you. And then also something that is related to that also troubles me about a lot of these films is I think that sometimes this is something you see in comedies more broadly, particularly in the 80s, was the idea that if you just keep bothering a woman long enough and asking her out long enough, that she's going to fall in love with you.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that it's somehow a matter of just being persistent.
Yeah, persistence. Yeah.
The notion that
and
any woman can love you if you wear them down.
Right. And to me, I think what really bothers me about that, and really I find kind of terrifying about it, is in that instance, they're not thinking of the woman as a person. It's not like, oh, I want to get to know this person and talk to her about stuff. It's like, I want to have a girl and I'll get one, however. Like, you're not really thinking of the woman as a person with agency and a mind of her own in that scenario. She's a prize.
Yeah, prize to be won. Exactly.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
That always bothered me. You mentioned before that we had a name for this on AV Club. It was called The Full Boil.
The Full Boil.
What was that about?
Yeah, so it was a reference to an ongoing subplot in the first season of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Very funny show that is going to that is facing some real troubles on how to continue right now. Side note on that matter. Turns out that people might not be so welcoming of a comedy about police officers at this particular moment.
Yeah, it's very, talk about ideas pervasive in the culture, the whole concept of propaganda. I'll admit I hadn't heard about it until last summer, but when I learned about it, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that is a very subtle way that the culture kind of molds the way people see the world.
I think kind of accidental sometimes too, honestly. I mean, we could probably do a full episode about this. I mean, the fact of the matter is that movies about cops are often very exciting, and it's that whole holding two ideas in your head at the same time. I really enjoy movies about investigations. Also, I'm not a big fan of the cops, so
right?
Can you reconcile those two things? I don't know.
Absolutely.
In any case, The Full Boil referred to in season 1 of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There was a running subplot about Boyle sort of relentlessly pursuing one of the other officers in his squadron, which is Rosa, and him basically refusing to take no for an answer. And a lot of the comedy was built around the fact that she had no interest in him, but he just kept pursuing her. And we were supposed to, I think, sort of find it charming that he wouldn't take no for an answer.
Yeah, or relatable even.
Relatable, yeah. And I really do feel like, obviously Brooklyn Nine-Nine is not the first piece of entertainment to do this by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh no.
You know?
No. It was pretty much ubiquitous in 80s teen movies.
Oh yeah, and they retired. I mean, the show actually ended up retiring it, maybe because Michael Schur and the rest of the showrunners sort of looked at it and said, okay, maybe this isn't the best thing to be putting out there into the world. But I do feel like I have felt like since I was young, this idea that you really just have to. That a woman might be interested in you, but you just can't give up. And I think that it really is just a recipe for harassment. I mean, really, if somebody says no to you, that's it. You're done. You know, tap out.
This is one of the things that made me run away screaming from like Hollywood ideas of romance. I was like, absolutely not. No.
Yep. So I'm with you on that one. I hate that one too. And I've seen it reflected in people in my own life, I would say. I mean, honestly, even something like The Office in those early, I now look at Jim's behavior on The Office, and I'm sorry, I know that show is very popular, and I love a lot of its early.
Well, two
early
things
stuff.
can be true, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know? I mean,
I look at him and I just think, dude, she's engaged. Like, you basically have gotten a no from her. Like, it's time to let that to extinguish that torch. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But yours that you hate also has a name, which I think is pretty fun.
Yeah, I've always hated the Baxter. That cliche.
Okay.
And there's a Michael Showalter movie that is named for this cliche. I actually can't remember if he came up with the name for it or not. I'm having a hard time remembering. I think I'm failing the listeners right now, but I think there might have been an actual character named Baxter in one of these films who occupies this role. But it's the idea, basically, the obnoxiously convenient idea, in my opinion, that so you sort of have a love triangle, and you have the two main characters who are destined to fall in love. But one of them is with somebody else. It's usually the woman. She's with a man. She's either going to be married to him soon, or has been in a long relationship with him. And what happens is that gradually our heroine realizes that she would rather not be with this guy who's usually he tends to be kind of a nice, understanding dude. She'd rather be with the more rakish, roguish character, you know?
Right. He's safe.
Exactly.
And the new guy's excited.
But real love isn't safe, you know, it's that idea. So so the old boyfriend basically like looks at the situation, realizes that that the woman doesn't love him, and then sort of politely, graciously steps aside. And, you know.
Yeah, he's like, I'm not going to stand in your way. I want you to be happy. And I see how happy he makes you. Yeah.
Which is bullshit, because even if you realize that in a rational way, even as a person, if you realize that the person you're with is not right for you and that they could be happier with someone else, nobody is so mature and enlightened and centered that they're not going to feel some feelings of rejection when this person says, I prefer this other person's company to yours.
Right.
So
yeah, you're boring. P.S. Bye.
Exactly.
You're just gonna take that graciously. Yeah.
So it's all, for me, that cliche has always been kind of one of the more obnoxious examples of bad romantic comedies taking shortcuts to make the audience feel good. Because honestly, what that requires is if that character behaved in the way that somebody really would behave in this situation, it might complicate the happily ever after that the movie is setting up. It might complicate our feelings of elation or relief that the two main characters are actually getting together. Because if you actually have to think about, basically that character is giving the audience an excuse to not feel bad about the fact that he's being dumped.
Yeah, I mean, really, he exists in the movie to give the protagonist a conflict.
Yes.
Because otherwise there would be no conflict. Otherwise it would just be, I met this exciting new person and isn't that great?
A conflict, but then also an easy out. So that she doesn't have to feel guilty about it either, because he's so understanding about it. He's like, listen, I'm going to do what you can't do, and I'm going to say this is okay. Go. It's like he's letting that character off the hook, and I've always hated that cliche.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about cliches that you like? I mean, you said that you are a secret softie. Always have been a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of ones that that make me laugh more than they make me angry. You know, I mean, things like the run to the airport or the.
Oh, I love the run to the airport.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I do love that one because Number one, it's always a fun reminder of how different things were before 9/11.
It's true. You can always get
When
to
they-
you can always go to the gate.
They make it right to the
Yeah,
gate.
I know. It's like that scene in Love Actually where that kid runs through, which that is a post 9/11 movie, by the way. But
Well,
I always think like, man, that kid's lucky he didn't just get fucking gunned down. You know?
Homeland Security's gonna have a word with that kid.
Yeah, no shit. He's on a no-fly list now.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who, if I encounter, if there's a, I mean, this is sort of this is a side note as well, but this week, over the last couple of weeks, we watched, that movie came out, The Little Things, that John Hancock's sort of detective thriller starring Denzel Washington, and I had a good time with that film because it is kind of just wall-to-wall cliches.
Yeah.
And I like to sometimes just like I think there's a certain brazen pleasure in a film that just lines them up one by one.
Yeah, exactly. A film that's like, he's got a past, and you're gonna find out it's exactly what you think it is.
And I don't know if it's just a form of like, you've seen these things enough, so just seeing them, seeing a movie do them again is just automatically funny. I feel that way a lot with a lot of romantic comedies where I'm like, okay, I've seen this convention a million times before. I'm more amused by the filmmakers thinking they can just use it again than anything else.
I wonder if it's partially where when you see a cliche like that unfolding on screen, it sort of gives you permission to kind of just relax and enjoy the ride because you know what's going to happen.
Oh, maybe that's
it. Kind of ties into our spoiler discussion last week, actually.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a permission to turn your brain off, sort of. Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, you know what's going to happen. Just enjoy.
Yeah, totally. But one I genuinely love is actually goes back to Jane Austen, and you could call it the Mr. Darcy convention from Pride and Prejudice. And I think this is a bit of maybe I like this particular convention or cliche because it's self-flattering in a way, but I really like the idea of the romantic lurking inside the cynic.
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed that. Somebody who it feels really unyielding and prickly throughout, but reveals in the end that they secretly have this wellspring of feeling inside of them. That is a self-flattering idea that I sort of like to have about myself. I like to think that perfectly describes me. That I'm just the model of cynical cool. But if you really get to know me, you'll get to the secret heart inside of me. So
that's so funny.
So, I mean, obviously that is a cliche at this point too. You see variations on it all the time. I think that in its own way, Humphrey Bogart is sometimes playing a Mr. Darcy-ish character in his own way. Totally different cultural milieu. But this idea of somebody who comes across as gruff or prickly or difficult, but at heart they're really romantic. It appeals to me. And I'm almost always swept off my feet by that in a film when somebody who appears to be really just really iron and cynical, when we see that they really do love another character, it gets to me. I don't know. Yeah,
I feel like this honestly, this question says something about us and who we are as people, because like you said, that kind of speaks to like what the way you think about yourself. And mine, the thing that I like that I think kind of speaks to the way that I think about myself is I kind of like when at the beginning of the movie the two characters bicker a lot and they argue and they seem like they hate each other, but really they're secretly like intensely attracted to each other.
I mean, that's kind of an extension of the Darcy rule in a way, because
totally, it's like a pricklier version of the Darcy. Yeah, the one that's and not in the sense that like one character hates the other, in the sense that there's sort of this mutual bickering going on back and forth, and they kind of like trade insults and are like ugh about each other, but secretly deep down they really are into each other. That's one that I really enjoy.
It undercuts the sentimentality, I think, doesn't it? I mean, because if the characters seem a little spiky and and if they're sparring a little bit, it doesn't feel quite as gooey, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that like for me, something that I find really romantic is like just feeling like you're on the level with someone intellectually and you can have like conversations back and forth and that you're well matched, you know, like you get each other mentally and each other's sense of humor and you can kind of trade that rapid fire banter back and forth, which actually ties into my favorite kind of romantic comedies are the 30s and 40s screwball comedies, you know, along the lines of like the Philadelphia Story or All About Eve, or one that I watched over the holidays was Christmas in Connecticut. Those types of films where it's all about the Hawksian woman and the characters trading a lot of banter back and forth. To me, that's really romantic, engaging on that intellectual level. Like flirting through banter is really romantic to me.
And particularly for the time period, I mean, those movies came closer than a lot of honestly, probably a lot of what we even see today, but of treating the two characters like they are on equal footing.
Absolutely. A lot of the times, the ones that I like from this era, the screwball ones, it's, you know, the so-called new woman of the 30s and 40s, you know, who is career oriented and educated, and Katharine Hepburn wears pants in these movies a lot to show how strong-willed she is.
I was gonna say Hepburn is sort of the she is sort of the model of this idea, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, she embodies this idea in a lot of her films from this period. Well, I think it kind of speaks to this inner conflict that I have about romance, because these films, like, explicitly a lot of the time are about a conflict between career and romance, because, you know, in the time that this was set, it was more expected that when you got married, you would quit your job. You would just be a wife from then on out, and you didn't do anything else. And a lot of times the conflict for the character in these films isn't between two men. It's between fulfilling yourself as a person and like sort of absorbing yourself into another person.
Well, and you see that still today, don't you? In a way, you see like a really distant descendant of that in something like the annual Hallmark Lifetime Christmas movies, which often often have these women who are like successful career women working at a newspaper or an architect firm or something, and they go back to their hometown, and it's suddenly pitting their professional future against their romantic future, right?
Yeah, and in those, it's a lot of times it's a conflict between city and country, which is something that speaks to what I think is a pretty common experience of like leaving your hometown to go try to find work somewhere else. I actually low-key really like those Christmas movies. I talked about this in the Christmas episode too, but I wrote a column about this back around Christmas time. And yeah, well, spoiler alert, I suppose, for these movies are so formulaic. I'm going to reject the idea of spoilers for them right now. The modern thing about them is in the end of a lot of these movies, the heroine finds a way to do her fulfilling fancy job from the small town.
Right. Well, which makes sense in our remote world.
Have it all.
It's not that much of a stretch that a lot of these jobs could be done remotely, as as we're seeing now, for example, you know?
Right. Yeah. And, you know, you'll see that that conclusion at the end of some 30s and 40s screwball comedies, too.
That's true. Yep. They actually do manage to have it all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. But the ones that you like are from a slightly later era, and I'm curious for your perspective on these.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I'm picking a particular era of sort of romantic cinema that I respond the most to, I think it might be the 60s, to be honest. And I think that has something to do with that era being caught between old and new in its own way, is that you're still seeing vestiges of an old Hollywood, for example, and in a sort of old world cinema, but you're also seeing this flush of new that's going on at that time. I mean, I sort of think of 1960 as the dividing line between classic cinema and new cinema. I really do think that
I think that's fair.
If you were going to divide the history of movies down the middle, I really do think that regardless of how far back that actually is now based on where we are, I do think the 60s is a great dividing line, or 1960 itself, because...
Well, yeah, Breathless came out in 1960. So.
That's right. Psycho is also 1960. I think of Psycho as a moment that's like, this is literally cutting a jagged line through movies, like down the middle. And I think that was reflected in romantic cinema too. I think a lot of what the New Wave was doing, I mean, even the more radical of of new wave directors like Godard have there's a romantic inside of them as well. So you see a lot of these filmmakers like Romer and Resnais and Truffaut making films that are romances, and that are sometimes love stories or relationship films, but they're making them with this kind of shit hot style and this sense, this sort of youthful energy and this wealth of new ideas. And I think I sometimes wish that I could have come up during that time for movies. How exciting that must have been to experience. But even looking back, those movies, I still find them really exciting. And I think a lot of the time it has to do with the fact that they are. So, I mean, like Truffaut is a total romantic, and I think that a lot of them are really romantic, but they're also cool, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting because something that I see in those films also is like there's the romance between the characters and there is an unabashed romanticism, but there's also the movies are also kind of in love with this idea of the future and a new era and reinvention.
And with other movies too.
Right. Yeah, totally.
I mean, if you think of where a lot of those filmmakers came from, many of them starting as French film critics, writing about movies. A lot of them are in love with the medium itself. And as a movie geek, that's intensely appealing to me. And any movie that feels both like any movie romance that's also about a love affair with movies itself is going to have some appeal to me, I'd say.
Well, sure. Yeah, you're a film critic.
Yeah.
In general, though, would you say that you would rather have like a rom-com or a tragic romance? I think I know which one you're going to say because I know you.
Oh, tragic romance all the way.
Yeah.
I mean, I love tragic romances. I'm a bit of a glutton for punishment, I think. As a viewer, I like movies that hit your heart really hard, and there are some beautiful films over the years about I'm not even necessarily talking about divorce dramas or anything,
right?
Which is that's its own category.
Yeah, it's exactly. If someone says what's a good romance, I would not say Marriage Story or
right,
Kramer
exactly.
Yeah. That's a whole different area, man.
Yep. But like one convention that I find that wrecks me every time is, and it's not exclusive to romantic cinema, but is this idea of two characters who make an intense connection over a short period of time and then say goodbye forever.
Yeah, one of the ones that I know is both our favorites is in romantic cinema, that is something that really gets me too, particularly the idea of like two people meet and they're soulmates, but circumstances mean they just can't be together. That's like the most it's the most sad, beautiful idea. And I know a film that we both really like that is all about that is In the Mood for Love.
Yep. Mm-hmm. That's an all-timer.
Wise film.
That's an all-timer for me. I mean, there's a lot of things about that film to love. I really feel like even the way it's shot, it's one of the most beautifully filmed movies ever made, I think. And a lot of that, I feel like Wong found a way to capture via his camera the longing itself, basically desire for another person.
Yes, just the way he frames the shots, like they'll be really close to each other, but also seem far away from each other at the same time.
Totally. So for those who don't know, In the Mood for Love, again, it's Wong Kar-wai, his film from 2000. It came out in the U.S. in 2001. It's sort of a story of very tentative. Courtship's not even the right word. It's basically about two neighbors living in Shanghai in the early 1960s who both of their spouses are always away on trips, and it eventually becomes clear that their spouses may in fact be having an affair. And the two of them become attracted to each other, and I guess the simplest way to put it would be to say that they fall in love. But the movie never unfolds in a way that, in the conventional way that a film like this does. It is mostly about two characters who basically are standing on the precipice of action for the entire film, and they're played by Maggie Cheung and Tony Leung, who two of the most beautiful people in the world, two of the most beautiful movie stars.
Listen, everything about this movie is beautiful. The people, the costumes, the settings, cinematography, just everything about it is just visually rapturous. Beautiful.
Yes. And I do think that it is the ultimate film about unrequited romance. Although maybe unrequited isn't necessarily quite the right word. Maybe unfulfilled.
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah,
I don't want to say too much about where the film goes, but the movie is very much about this attraction that exists, and the film is interested almost exclusively in this attraction and how it evolves, and how these characters feel frozen by social propriety, and how they feel frozen by their current circumstances, and how the obstacles that are in the place. I guess that's what all romantic comedies are ultimately, is about putting obstacles in front of people. But this film is about these two people sort of feeling unable to step over those obstacles into each other.
Mm-hmm. And something that's interesting, I'd say longing is really the feeling conveyed by In the Mood for Love. And something that's interesting is that is also the pervasive feeling in a lot of these lesbian period romances that have come out recently.
Very much.
A lot of those are about longing and tension, and just two people just barely touching pinkies against one another.
I'm a real sucker for it. I got to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I really just the idea of a really slow seduction and characters who are constantly moving closer and closer to each other, but not quite touching or just barely touching, is, I think, really sexy and really romantic. And Portrait of the Lady on Fire is a recent one, is a recent addition to this. And I think that it is one of the more romantic films that's come out in the last probably the last decade, to be honest.
At least it's one of the most romantic films I've ever seen.
Yeah.
We did a video episode of Film Club about Portrait of a Lady on Fire last year.
Yeah.
And something that I said there is that film conveys the feeling of feeling seen by someone, and someone seeing you and seeing everything about you and knowing everything about you, and that process of falling in love, that is just, oh my God, it's so romantic, just feeling seen.
Absolutely. I remember writing about, to that end, actually, I remember writing about the film when it came out in my review, and talking about the idea that a lot of movie romances promote this idea of love at first sight, the notion that you see somebody and you immediately know that that's the person that you want. And this is a film that does something almost the opposite, in a sense, that suggests that to really love somebody, you have to know them, and to know them, you have to watch them. In a non-creepy way. I don't mean outside their window with binoculars, but
but that's kind of what's so exciting about a film like Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I don't think that, the Celine Sciamma was consciously saying, I'm going to rebuke Say Anything. I don't think she was doing that on purpose. I think she was just expressing possibly her own ideas about what love is. Yeah. But it is a rebuke to that idea of just get a girl, and it doesn't matter who the girl is. It's like, no, who the girl is everything. Yes. That's what is so romantic about it. Yeah.
Totally.
So a community, like a fandom, you could say, that I think is really widely misunderstood and has largely been sort of, I guess the word is victimized by this misogynist cultural aspect of that anything romantic and therefore geared towards women is somehow inferior, is readers of romance novels. It's a very large, very passionate community who are really into romance novels, and I watched a documentary about it called Love Between the Covers. It was really interesting if you are interested in this community at all. And so something that I'm realizing about myself recently is I think I like the TV film equivalent. This is maybe a little less serious than In the Mood for Love or Portrait of a Lady on Fire. The TV or film equivalent of one of those historical romance novels, like, I really like those. I like Outlander. Okay. I didn't like Bridgerton as much, but, it wasn't necessarily my style. But just, like, kind of, like, a lot of hair blowing in the breeze on the moors, and then, like, a lot of sex scenes with hot guys in kilts. Like, I like that kind of stuff. I think it's fun. And it's funny for me because my mom actually got me into Outlander, which, if you've seen it, is a show that has a lot of sex on it. And we're a repressed Midwestern household. So it's been kind of a fun experience for me, kind of like getting in touch with that part of myself through discussing things about Outlander besides the sex scenes with my mom.
Do you diligently avoid that in conversation?
It's like when you're 14 and you're watching a movie with your parents and you're like, I'm gonna get up and go get some popcorn when the sex scene comes on. It's unbearably awkward. And something that I've talked about a few times already on this podcast, because it's something that I think about, in terms of my own development as a person and kind of unraveling my internalized misogyny and things like that, is the way that my relationship to these films has evolved over the years. And this I don't think has anything to do with internalized misogyny, but there have been times in my life where I've been going through a difficult time in my own personal love life, where I don't want to watch romances at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I got separated in 2015. We didn't get divorced until almost a year later. But that entire year, I had a really hard time watching anything with a romantic subplot in it, or like I would just avoid a rom-com or a romance outright. But a lot of films have romantic subplots in them.
That's a lot to avoid.
Well, you can't avoid it entirely, particularly doing our job. If you get assigned a review, you can't say like, oh, I'm sorry, that has a love plot in it, I can't watch it.
Yeah.
But it was really painful for me for like a year to watch any kind of on-screen romance, because it just made me feel like, yeah, I fucked that up. I mean, to be perfectly blunt about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, a divorce is a trauma.
Yeah.
And there's no, I mean, I think as a culture we're understanding that if somebody has been through a trauma like being like being held up at gunpoint or something, I'm pulling a random example. I don't think anybody would blink at that person saying, I don't want to watch a movie with guns in it.
Right.
But if you've been through a tough divorce, for example, I think that it's harder to convince anyone that I mean, as you said, you really can't do it doing our job. It's impossible. But even people who don't watch as much movies as we watch, everything has a romantic subplot.
Everything has a love interest. Everything.
Yeah. I mean, even the horror movies that we watch. I mean, most of them have. There is an element of romance in them because it is it is a fundamental part of the human experience, So
right, exactly, yeah.
I feel for you.
That's and that kind of something that I've seen in rom-coms more recently that I think is a kind of a cool and refreshing change, and in comedies, mostly comedies geared towards women more specifically, and sometimes they're not even that good of movies, but I think this is a cool development. Like, there was a film that came out a few years ago starring Dakota Johnson and Rebel Wilson called How to Be Single. Mm-hmm. That was a rom-com that I actually thought was, it kind of flew under the radar, but I actually thought it was pretty good. It was one of the first examples I had seen of this, to where really, like, it starts off as a rom-com where, Dakota Johnson moves to New York and she gets this job at a magazine, and she has this wild partying coworker played by Rebel Wilson, and she kind of gets caught up in these different romances. But really, it's a film about her falling in love with herself, which I think is a cool, refreshing change from the idea of if you don't get a man at the end, then you failed.
Right.
And something that, and I've started seeing this more often in Hollywood comedies, and the film Like a Boss was not very good, but it was structured like a rom-com, but it wasn't, the two main characters played by Tiffany Haddish and Rose Byrne, they weren't in love with one another, but it was a friend rom-com where the film hinged on, it followed the rom-com formula of they're together, they break up, and they get back together, but it was two friends running a business together instead of a couple falling in love. And I think that, love is great, but it's not the be-all, end-all of existence. And right. I think that, like romantic love, and I think that it's healthy for films to deal with other kinds of love. Platonic love between friends, familial love, self-love. There's all these different kinds of love that you need to have all of them kind of to have a fulfilled life. Or, if you're not interested in romance, you can do without that one. Some people are asexual and they're not interested in this kind of stuff. Or aromantic.
I totally agree. And there have been movies over the last 10 years or something that have really scratched that itch in some ways. I mean, a movie that I love that I talk about a lot is Noah Baumbach's Frances Ha. And that movie to me has the energy of a romantic comedy, I think, at times. But the central relationship in it is really, Frances with herself, but it's also,
yes.
There's kind of a relationship between her and her former roommate as well. And again, not a romantic relationship, a platonic friendship roommate relationship. And it can be really refreshing to see movies examine those kind of relationships, whether they be positive or negative, toxic or healthy. Just seeing films that really get into the vagaries of friendship, for example, because friendships can be every bit as complicated as romances can.
Totally. And the breakup of a friendship can be very painful.
Yeah, for very much so.
Yeah.
Yep.
And getting a new friend can be a fun, exciting rush. Yeah, it's definitely a valid relationship that people have in their lives.
Yep.
Yeah. So for Valentine's Day, we're going to leave our listeners with a couple film recommendations for things that they can consider watching for Valentine's Day. And the film that I picked won't be a surprise based on what I said up top, because it contains two of the things I said I like in this movie. A couple that bickers, who actually are in love with one another and are perfect for each other. And it's a 40s screwball comedy about a conflict between career and marriage that does find a resolution in the end. And that is His Girl Friday, starring Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. This is my favorite romantic comedy of all time. And I first saw it when I was in high school, and I just fell in love with it. It's got a line. Well, it's about a reporter, first of all, so of course I found that very romantic. And when I go back and watch it now, there's some things that I see that I didn't really see when I first saw it that, you know, are problematic, I suppose. But, you know, something that we've said a few times on here is two things can be true, and you can like some problematic things. Like Cary Grant's character, and it is very manipulative, and he manipulates Rosalind Russell. So this is a film that came out in 1940. It was directed by Howard Hawks, who, if you're not familiar with the concept of the Hawksian woman, that's something that's really interesting to look into. He's known for his portrayal of like strong-minded, independent women, which, as we said, was pretty rare in the 30s and 40s. So it's based on a play called The Front Page that was first made into a movie that came out before His Girl Friday. But the interesting thing about The Front Page is it's not about a romance. It's about two coworkers. And they turned it into a romance for His Girl Friday. So the basic concept is Rosalind Russell is a former reporter who comes back to the office of her ex-husband / former boss, who runs a newspaper in New York. And, you know, they very recently divorced, and it seems to have been acrimonious. And then she just disappeared for 4 months. And she comes back. I'm so sorry, Dowd. She comes back with a Baxter. There is a Baxter in this movie. She comes back with a Baxter. She does have a Baxter.
That's true.
And she's completely using him. Yeah. She comes back to her old boss. His name's Walter Burns. He's a very powerful newspaper editor in New York, with her Baxter, whose name is Bruce, played by Ralph Bellamy, and says, "I'm getting married. I'm gone. I'm leaving the newspaper business forever. Goodbye." And and he says, "No, you can't quit so easy. You're the best reporter I ever had." And so that kind of kicks off these hijinks where he kind of sets up this series of obstacles, like you said, for her to jump over, and he kind of sets them up knowing that she is going to fall back in love with being a newspaper reporter and realize that being a reporter is her true love, and she absolutely cannot run off to the suburbs to be a good wife because A, she was born to be a reporter, and B, her Baxter is very boring and he is very exciting. And they trade a lot of barbs throughout the film, Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. And it just really ties into my idea of love as a respectful relationship between two equals who take the piss out of one another, but it's because they love each other and know each other so well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key to why in that film it does not feel offensive or obnoxious that he is kind of manipulating her, because in a sense the movie lets us know very early on that Grant's character, he really does know her, and he knows. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of
she knows him. She knows all his tricks.
Yes. And a lot of the film, I think, is about the two of them negotiating a return to the status quo of their romance. I mean, it's sort of the quintessential comedy of remarriage. And I think it feels like a mutual game with them. I think that she knows what's going on as much as he does, and he may be kind of nudging her back into this life that she doesn't really want to leave. But I think the key is that she doesn't really want to leave it.
She doesn't really want to leave it, and that's why I don't really think of it. It doesn't bother me either, because the way I see it is it's really as these two manipulative people who, there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of really funny, sparkling dialogue in this. And at one point, Ralph Bellamy says to Rosalind Russell, like, he's a slippery one, isn't he? And she goes, he comes by it honestly, his grandfather was a snake. Which there's a lot of very funny lines in this. And a lot of really great interplay between Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. For example, there's a scene where they're out at the three of them are out at lunch, and there's this very subtle kind of movement between, and it's Rosalind Russell kicking him under the table whenever he says something untoward. It's her kicking him and him kind of jumping a little bit. Very, very funny interplay between the two leads. But I really see it as they're both kind of snakes. She's definitely using him to get better. Like, I don't think she ever truly is in love with this man who she's going to run off and marry. She's kind of using him to get back at the man she truly is in love with.
Oh, 100%, which is awful in its own way, but
she's definitely using him.
It's impossible to hate these characters though, because they're so
really
charming and so witty. I mean, the dialogue in this movie, for one thing, it comes at like 200 miles per hour. I mean, these people are talking fast at each other. There have been tons and tons of parodies of His Girl Friday over the years. I think one of the most recent ones was in BoJack Horseman. Actually, the final season of BoJack Horseman had an extended His Girl Friday parody in it. I don't feel like anybody in the years since it, no matter how many imitations we get of His Girl Friday, I don't feel like we've ever seen one that really truly replicates the pleasure of their interactions and just the speed and wit of the dialogue. In terms of romantic comedies, it's certainly I think it's one of the funniest of all time. And I do think that it's sort of caustic wit. It doesn't undercut the romance, but it's a nice tempering force. I mean, this is not a super sentimental film, but it's one that I think is in its own way very romantic.
Yeah, it's all about trying to keep up. The movie kind of looks at you and goes, like, these two can keep up with each other, try to keep up with them.
Which is why they're a perfect match. Nobody can really keep up with them. And it's like they found the match in each other. And I agree, it's a wonderful film.
Yeah, and it has a line that I really like is Rosalind Russell, at the beginning she says, I'm going to retire to the suburbs and play bridge. That's what kind of she's threatening. Like, yeah, well, I'm so talented, I'm going to go waste it. Nah. and then at the end she says, I'm not a suburban bridge player, I'm a newspaper man. And it's her kind of like refinding herself. And I always found that to be very charming.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so if I have a pick, I'm gonna cheat this, and I'm gonna go with 3 movies, but they are intimately related. They are a part of a single franchise, a trilogy, if you will, and that is the Before films by Richard Linklater.
Yeah.
And there are 3 of them. Were all released 9 years apart. They star Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy. And the first one came out in 1995. So Hawke plays this American kid in his 20s, and he is on a train from Budapest, and he meets this character played by Julie Delpy, and she is also traveling on the same train, and the two of them get off in Vienna. And they walk around Vienna. I do kind of think it is the platonic ideal of a date movie. And I mean, you have these two attractive 20-somethings who are literate and opinionated, and I mean, the movie really is in love with the idea of conversation, which should be no surprise given that it's a Richard Linklater film. Yes. But it basically puts forward the idea that falling in love with somebody is often about just talking to them for a really long time. I won't spoil how the movie ends, but there have been 2 sequels, both again directed by Richard Linklater, and the sequels were also written by the 2 stars, by Ethan Hawke and by Julie Delpy, and they sort of look at the way that this relationship. They sort of pick up with these characters the same amount of time that has passed between the production. So it's always been 9 years. So the second film, Before Sunset, came out in 2004, and the third one, and currently final one, Before Midnight, came out in 2013. And we're basically seeing these characters 9 years older than they were in the last movie. And
yeah, that passage of time and sort of following characters over real time is kind of a signature of Linklater's, because he also made Boyhood.
Yes, exactly. He's super fascinated by the idea of conflating real time and cinematic time, and Boyhood obviously packs 12 years of filming into one movie. These films take a different strategy, which is that they just sort of pick up after that period of time has passed. But we're seeing the characters that much older than they really are in real life, and which is I don't know, is honestly a real shortcut to poignancy in my opinion. I mean, just seeing these characters age on screen is affecting in its own right.
Absolutely.
But to me, this is like the whole experience of watching these films is among the more romantic experiences you can get from movies, even as the series gradually, I mean, these are not films that deny the challenges that would face two people in this situation. And as we see the things that sort of get in the way in these characters' lives, and they're estranged at the beginning of Before Sunset, and I won't. For those who haven't seen it, I actually don't really want to say what happens in the third one, but it's definitely about these characters navigating the change from the instant infatuation of meeting somebody you like and spending a night with them to where they are by the end of the third film, and what it means to sustain a romance, sustain a love story. And
yes.
I don't know how many people are gonna have a good 6 hours to kill on Valentine's Day, but if you wanted to do a series over the weekend, for example, if you wanted to watch one Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I can think of
that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I really think that even putting that little bit of, because the thing about these movies is that having to wait basically a decade between them really, I will say, expand, sort of ballooned their significance, because you have waited that long too, in a way.
Right. Yeah, that much of your life has passed, and you're in a different place in your life than you were 9 years ago.
Exactly. So there's no way to replicate that, short of people, like if you have not seen the films, if you want to watch Before Sunrise this year and then wait 9 years and see Before Sunset,
you could, I guess,
and then wait 9 years more and watch Before Midnight, you definitely could. But I think putting a night between them might at least approximate that a little bit.
And I think you're exactly right, where like you said, the characters do have their problems, but it is not a divorce drama like we were talking about before. It's not about the process of falling out of love. It is about different stages of love.
Yes.
And how over the years a relationship and what being in love is and what it means and how you do it, it can change over long periods of time. And I think that's something this trilogy really gets at really beautifully.
That's a perfect way to describe it. It really, the grand experiment of it is how, looking at love in the way that it changes over time. Yeah, so highly recommend that if you're in the mood for love. Okay, Katie, so next week we're doing something a little different. We want to hear from you, the listeners. We're going to be fielding your questions on a special AMA episode of Film Club. To submit a question, all you have to do is head on over to avclub.com. There's an article there called Ask Our Critics Anything, and they'll answer your questions on Film Club next week. If you post your question in the comment section of that article, we'll consider it for the episode. You have until Tuesday, February 16th at noon CST to submit your questions. We look forward to hearing what you want to know about the AV Club, about film criticism, or just our own strange taste in movies. And once again, the headline of the article is Ask Our Critics Anything, and they'll answer your questions on Film Club next week. This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Reif. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Thanks for listening.
Bye.